Good morning, everyone, or good evening, depending on where you join us around the planet. Welcome to this Victoria Law Foundation Research Network event on the Justice for All report. I'm Lynn Holtain, I'm the Executive Director here at the VLF, and it is splendid to have you with us. And we are so delighted to have Maaike and Swati with us for this session, setting the global context on access to justice. I will introduce them very soon. But first, the VLF stands on unceded Wurundjeri land, and I respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians, recognising their abiding connection to the land, its waterways and community. It's my privilege to pay my respects to their elders and to all the generations who have nurtured this land for over 50,000 years and continue to do so. We believe at the VLF that acknowledging the past is an essential step in building a better and more equitable future. We recognise the impact of colonisation, its legacy of injustice, and the ongoing marginalisation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We aim to break down the barriers to justice for all Victorians through our work in research, education and grants. We're committed to making a sincere and positive contribution to a better justice system for all of us, especially those who are vulnerable and in most need. So just before we set sail today, a few housekeeping matters. We are in a webinar format, as you're probably aware by now, so only the panelists can be seen and heard throughout. Please use the chat function to introduce yourself and to make comments, but for questions, make sure you go to the Q&A function. And you can also upvote other people's questions if you like the look of those and would like to hear them answered. And we will get to as many of those questions at the end of the session as we can. Don't fear, though, if you have to bolt off, or if you know of somebody who's really keen to see this session and hasn't been able to make it this morning. We are recording it and we will send it to you afterwards, and we will make sure that it's available on our website as well. So let's get this show on the road. Beaming in from New York today, our speakers are Maaike de Langen and Swati Mehta. Maaike is Program Lead on Justice for All, a program of the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just and Inclusive Societies at New York University's Centre for International Cooperation, where she's worked since 2018. The program builds on the Justice for All report, which we'll hear much more about today, published by the Task Force on Justice, which sets out an agenda for the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goal number 16, which, as many of you will be aware, commits to access to justice for all. Maaike started her career in the Netherlands and has had national and international roles ever since. She worked at the Van Vollenhoven Institute for Law, Governance and Development at Leiden University, and then for the UN Development Programme in Africa and New York on governance, human rights, access to justice and legal empowerment of the poor. She was first advisor to the National Ombudsman of the Netherlands for 8 years, creating and leading the Department for Strategy and Policy. Then in 2014, Maaike returned to Mali for a year to design the Dutch bilateral program on security and rule of law. And we are delighted to have her with us, together with one of her colleagues, Swati Mehta, who is a senior program officer with Justice for All at Pathfinders. She started out providing legal aid for women and then moved on to systemic reform. And more recently, Swati's work has focused on legal empowerment, as well as decentralization and democratization of justice, putting people at the center of justice programming, which is a theme that we are very familiar with. Working with several civil society organizations, the UN and others in South and Southeast Asia, Swati's designed, managed and led several justice programs over the last 20 years, publishing on legal empowerment, policing, legal aid, and traditional, customary and informal justice systems. She's a Chevening Scholar and holds a Master of Laws in International Criminal Law, Criminology and Criminal Justice from King's College London. And this bit I am very keen to explore a bit more a bit later. She loves to engage with young people, artists and musicians on justice. So without further ado, let me pass the baton now to Nigel Balmer, our research director here at the Victoria Law Foundation, who'll give us a quick overview, if you like, of the subject matter and the context for our conversation. And I will join you again for the Q&A at the end. Nigel.
Thanks, Lynn. So we think of the justice gap as the difference between justice people want and what they actually receive. And unfortunately for most of the world, it's not so much a gap as a chasm. So from my perspective, decades of empirical legal research, including a good chunk of mine, tell us some similar core messages. First, people everywhere experience these justiciable problems. They're ubiquitous. Nonetheless, they can be amongst the most difficult and traumatic experiences in their lives. And they're fundamentally connected to life. They can have a profound impact on relationships, on health, on well-being. So being able to get to a just resolution really is critical. Second, despite this, inability to reach a just resolution or failure of access to justice is not a rarity, but kind of routine. So the world over, there's a huge gap between the problems people experience and those that they're able to justly resolve. And third, inequity is at the heart of this gap. So those least likely to be able to access a just resolution are often those with limited knowledge, limited resources or capabilities. They're more likely to be those who are marginalized or vulnerable. So justice inequity can easily reproduce, extend, entrench social inequity. And fourth, services and processes that we might hope could facilitate equal access to justice fail to do so. So a rethink's really required, one that moves away from a sort of myopic focus on how things have been done to date and acknowledges actual need, people's needs, people's capabilities. Now, luckily, there's a global movement in this direction towards bottom-up, people-centered approaches to justice, a movement towards ensuring equal access to justice for all that we see at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals that Lynn mentioned, specifically 16.3. And part of the reason we were very keen to hear from Swati and Maaike is that they and their collaborators and colleagues at NYU have been at the forefront of much of the development of SDGs and much of the thinking in this area from a really global perspective. Much of what they'll talk about today stems from their excellent Justice for All report. If you haven't read it, I recommend you do so, and we'll put a link in the chat. But what the report does is describe this movement towards people-centered justice that recognizes the imperative to put people, needs, and capabilities first, and also acknowledges the benefits of getting things right. Because of course, if you enable just resolution, it doesn't just resolve these problems, it can impact health, well-being, relationships, and society as a whole. So it can come with significant broad benefits. I want to leave Maaike and Swati to talk about their work, but attendees to our recent international forum or our previous network sessions will note some familiar themes around the importance of data and evidence, the potential of innovation, a focus on understanding impact, on developing joined-up approaches. While acknowledging that jurisdictions differ, the report also presents a powerful agenda for change and call to action. So we're really pleased and thankful that Swati and Maaike are able to give up their time this evening to join us, and I'll hand over to them. Thanks very much.
Great, thank you so much, and good morning, everyone. I'm speaking from you on yesterday's evening here in New York, but you're already a day ahead of us. So very happy to be with you all. I will kick us off with the first part of the presentation, and then hand it over to Swati a bit later on. First, let me thank Lynn and Nigel for these introductions and for the invitation to speak here to you about a topic that we cherish, which is providing equal access to justice for all. Let me just share my screen because we have a presentation that I will speak to. There we go. That is the first slide. So again, welcome. We will speak to the findings of the Justice for All report in a minute. And before that, I will say a few words just on our on the background, how we got to drafting the report, and also a little bit about Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies, which is the organization where we work. So it was already mentioned by Lynn, the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted in 2015 as an agenda with 17 goals for sustainable development, universal goals for all countries in the world to be achieved by 2030. Many of them very ambitious and broad in their reach. The reason those goals were very interesting for us working in the justice sector is that for the first time, access to justice for all was accepted as a universal goal for all countries and all people in the world to achieve. So this is SDG 16. You see it here on the slide. The full goal is to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, to provide access to justice for all, and to build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Now, as Nigel mentioned, there's a series of indicators and targets. 16.3 focuses specifically on equal access to justice for all. But I also like to say that this really puts justice at the heart of the goal itself. So 17 goals, and access to justice for all is at the heart of one of those. We also always like to point out that this agenda is universal. So it's not a development agenda in the sense of an agenda for developing countries. Every country is on the road to sustainable development, and this goal applies to all countries of the world. And lastly, that providing access to justice is really also a goal in itself, but also underpins the entire agenda. When SDG 16 was adopted in 2015, it was after a long discussion and long debate and some tough negotiations here in New York between the representatives of the countries. And there were a number of countries that had worked really hard to get access to justice or peace, justice, and inclusion in a broader sense accepted into this development agenda. And they then came together and formed the Pathfinders for Peaceful, Just, and Inclusive Societies. So once the goal was adopted, they came together, formed the Pathfinders, and set out this roadmap for peaceful, just, and inclusive societies. This was first published in 2017. And in that roadmap, it identified a number of areas to work on. But maybe before I dive into that, I should say that Pathfinders are a growing group of countries who are working on this area, who are working together in this field. We currently have 39 member countries. 42. I should correct that. We just have 3 new members. 42 member countries. And so it is very much a collaboration of countries who have come together around these goals. As I said, they work in 3 main areas. So SDG 16 was analyzed in that roadmap that I mentioned, and then divided into 3 areas of work: justice for all, which I will be speaking much more about, to shift from a world where justice is only available for the privileged few to one that protects human rights and provides justice for all. And 2 other areas of work where my colleagues at Pathfinders work on is inequality and exclusion, tackling inequality and exclusion so that all people have a fairer stake in a more sustainable future, and then halving global violence, significantly reduce all forms of violence everywhere, with the aim of halving the amount of violence we have in the world. As you will understand, these themes are of course closely connected because they all interact with one another. To reduce violence, you need to have access to justice. To promote equality and inclusion, access to justice is also critical. So back now then to the area of justice. So as I said, when the Pathfinders were founded, one of the first things they did was establish that roadmap, and then put together the task force on justice. The task force on justice worked mostly in 2018 and 2019, and really took this goal of achieving access to justice for all and analyzed it from the perspective of where were we towards achieving that goal and what was needed to get there. Those findings are all in the Justice for All report that I will come to in a second. But just to say that the task force at the time, it was chaired by ministers from Argentina, the Netherlands, and Sierra Leone, together with the elders. And very importantly, we did not do all this work alone. So the Pathfinders, as I mentioned, has a number of member countries, but it also has all these organizations here and many more actually working also on other themes who are joining the work. So it is a multi-stakeholder platform or collaboration of people and organizations who work in this area and who want to collaborate for better results. So in that time frame of 2018, 2019, all these organizations came together and worked towards the Justice for All report. So let's have a look at the report. You'll see it here. This was at the time it was published. It was available in English, French, and Spanish. We now also have Arabic, Portuguese and Indonesian, and a short version in Ukrainian. So we are, and in Japanese, I should say. So we are continuing to translate the report and make it available to other people. And that whole list of reports that you will see at the bottom are input reports. So throughout that process in 2018, 2019, organizations came together, provided data, evidence, did research, compiled evidence, and brought that together in that whole series of reports. So once you've read the Justice for All report, there's much more to discover on some of those specific topics. One last thing I will say before I dive into the findings of the Justice for All report itself is that the report and the work of the task force, of course, did not come out of nothing. There was quite a long history actually around some of these ideas, and an important commission, I should say, or an important event at the global level in talking about access to justice was this report, Making the Law Work for Everyone, from the Commission on Legal Empowerment of the Poor. That commission was active in 2007 to 2009, and for the first time really looked at how legal systems and access to justice and laws and institutions are connected to efforts to reduce poverty and to development in the broader sense. And the Commission focused very much on property rights, labor rights, and business rights as critical rights that people should be able to access in order to work their way out of poverty at the individual level, and also for societies to develop collectively. Then just to mention, and credit where credit is due, some of our good partners, the Open Society Foundations and Amati, worked very hard in those intermediate years to continue work on legal empowerment, but also to push for justice to be adopted and accepted into the Sustainable Development Goals. And then, as I have said before, those goals were adopted in 2015 in SDG 16. So back to the report then, and some of the key findings. And let me start with the key messages. The key messages after all this research and those 2 years of consultations are one, that we need to place justice at the heart of sustainable development. We cannot achieve any of the other goals if we do not have functioning justice systems that are accessible to everyone. We cannot end poverty, reduce inequality, and if we don't have justice at the center. And we need it also to reach the furthest behind first, which is a part of the SDGs agenda. We need justice to create conditions for shared and sustainable prosperity, and to promote peace and inclusion and protect fundamental rights. That, I guess, was to some extent accepted when it came into the agenda, but it's a core message of the report how critical the justice sectors and functioning justice systems are for people in the if you want to achieve sustainable development. And I should say, as a I guess disclaimer or a definition issue, when I speak of justice systems, we do have a very broad understanding of justice systems. So we don't look only at the formal system. We look very, very much in the broader sense of the word, or range of actors who are providing justice in people's lives and helping people stand up for their rights. The second key message is that we need to put people at the center of justice systems. We need to understand how men, women, and children experience justice and injustice. We need to draw on evidence of what works to meet people's justice needs. And we need justice that is delivered by an inclusive justice system, which is open to partnership with other sectors. And this is now become summarized as people-centered justice. You may have heard the term definitely at that conference that Nigel referred to earlier. So people-centered justice is growing, I think, in countries. There's a global movement for people-centered justice. And putting people at the center of justice systems is really about shifting the focus from the institutions and what the institutions need, or the processes or the buildings, to what is actually provided in people's lives. And do they have access to justice? Are they able to resolve their justice problems? The last key message is about moving from justice for the few to justice for all. And that was really about, there's a lot of people working in justice sector have a sense that the justice sector is actually doing quite well. So we felt when we were doing the Justice for All report that we needed data and evidence to kind of jolt people out of that notion that things are going very well, and really open their eyes of everybody working in the justice sector to this immense global justice gap, or as Nigel called it, chasm, justice chasm. So here we turn to one of the first and probably the most quoted finding of the Justice for All report. What we endeavored to do with our partners as we were going through that process was to make the first estimate of the global justice gap. And that is the gap, as I said, between where we are, what justice is provided to people, and where we want to be, the goal of SDG 16, providing justice for all. We found that 5.1 billion people are deprived of justice. They do not have meaningful access to justice, and that is 2/3 of the world population. You may have heard the number quoted. As I said, it's one of our probably one of the most quoted part of the Justice for All report. And the way we understand this gap is across three different dimensions. So the 4.5 billion, that's the highest number, are people who are excluded from social, economic, and political opportunities that the law provides. Now, what does that mean? So that includes all the people who are working in the informal economy, who do not have a contract for the land that they work on, or for the house where they live, who do not have legal identification documents. So those people, because they do not have the papers they need in those specific areas, whether it's regarded to their housing or their land, their work or their identity, they are already excluded in a way. They are unable to access justice and to stand up for their rights. And through that, they are in a position of vulnerability. 1.5 billion people have a criminal, civil, or administrative justice problem they cannot solve. And this data comes from the World Justice Project and HIL, who have been our long-standing partners in all this work. And they have looked through victimization studies, legal needs studies, and cross-country analysis. They identified the number of people that have a problem that are unable to resolve it. Now, the percentages vary a little bit from country to country. So the World Justice Project has a very interesting report that has the data per country. But at the global level, this adds up to 1.5 billion people who have justice problems they cannot resolve. And then there's a much smaller group, but also much more serious dimension of the justice gap, which is people who live in extreme conditions of injustice without any meaningful legal protections. And those are people who live in situations of war, who are stateless, who live in modern slavery. And so those are that's a smaller group, but those are extreme conditions of injustice. And again, all these numbers are from 2019. Unfortunately, the world has not been going in the right direction in many respects. So we don't have updated numbers. We hope to have enough data on justice to recalculate this at some point. But again, going back to the key messages, the central point here is that the justice systems, as we currently know them, do not provide justice for all. We have this massive gap that we need to address. So on to it's the second chapter and some of the key findings on the costing of justice and what it costs to society. So firstly, we took a look at the cost of injustice, and again, there's much more in the report. But just to run through some key elements, of course. Without justice, people and societies fail to reach their full potential. And another estimate that was made is that with justice problems that people are unable to resolve, they lose an average of 1 month wages. And taking all those justice problems together, including also the impact on their health, the OECD has estimated that everyday justice problems cost countries between 0.5 and 3% of their GDP. So that's a number that is, it's a conservative estimate, but it is an impressive number. And I think that can also be used to make the case for more investment in justice, that this exclusion from justice is not just wrong, it's also really hurting countries and hurting economies. Just a few more then. Every dollar invested in justice leads to $16 in benefit from reduced conflict risk, and there's a high return on investment. There's much more research actually needed to in that area. What is the return on investment in justice? but an overview we made at the time of everything that was available made it quite clear that there is a good return on investment. The other thing we did, and this is again looking at justice a little bit in the same way that that the world has looked at the goals relating to providing education for all, providing healthcare for all, is doing a costing exercise. Again, this is at the global level, abstract numbers, but critical to be considered a core part of what countries should be investing in. And I sometimes jokingly say that there's an ODI report that underlies these numbers. And I sometimes jokingly say that report is essentially 20 pages of caveats, because there is a lot of assumptions that have gone into this. But you have to start somewhere. And what we did with this exercise together with ODI is make this estimate of what it would cost to provide access to justice for all, universal access to basic justice services, to be a little bit more precise. And the numbers are $20 per person per year for low-income countries, $64 for middle-income countries, and $190 for high-income countries. And the reason that those numbers are quite different in those different countries is that a core part of those numbers are actually related to salaries for public service. This includes, for example, police, paralegals, lawyers, judges, et cetera, again, at that basic justice services level. But salaries is an important component in calculating these amounts, these costings. So that explains the difference between low, middle, and high income countries. Just quickly checking how I'm doing on time. Okay. So moving on then to the next problem. One of the or finding, I should say, one of the shifts we wanted to achieve with the Justice for All report is to really move the discussion from a focus on the institutions and the procedures and the laws and the buildings and the courts and the judges to what people are facing. And you probably have heard this, and you've probably experienced this in your work. Justice systems and the exact rules that apply are different between countries and sometimes even between states or provinces. But what we identified in the Justice for All report is that, in fact, the justice problems that people face are very similar around the world. So we identified 6 categories of most common justice problems. This is based on a wide range of national surveys and other legal needs surveys and other data. And so the 6 main categories are problems with money and debt or consumer problems, disputes over housing or land or conflicts with neighbors, difficulties relating access and quality of public services, violence and crime, family disputes, and problems at work as an employee or as a business owner. So those 6 main categories are by and large the most common justice problems that people face. And interestingly, when you start talking about these problems and you dive a little deeper, then immediately it becomes obvious that justice actors are only a part of the picture. And if you want to resolve these justice problems, you will need a much broader perspective on the justice system and how it collaborates, how it engages with other actors. It also draws the discussion back to people's real problems that they face in their lives, and away from those more theoretical and overly normative discussions about what the institution should be, but back to the empirical reality of what people actually face in their lives. I will have to speed up a little bit, I'm just seeing. So again, next section of findings in the Justice for All report is that when we say if you want to improve access to justice, you need to improve on, or you need to focus on improving people's justice journey. And we identified 3 core components of that justice journey: empowering people and communities, providing access to people-centered justice services, and ensuring fair outcomes. And in the report, you will find for all of these components more details and more examples, also from countries around the world who are tackling that. But let me just say that you will note that these are formulated in the abstract. It doesn't indicate who should be providing these services or who should be doing the legal empowerment. And that is because the actors that are actually engaged in this are that differs a lot from country to country. In some cases, the legal empowerment is typically done by civil society. In other countries, the government sees a big role for itself in empowering people and communities. Access to people-centered justice services is often also a mix. And it can be the government, it can be the judiciary, it can be paralegals, it can be legal clinics, university clinics, justice entrepreneurs, apps. You have all kinds of actors who can provide those services. But if you take that people-centered perspective, you will see that there needs to be legal empowerment. People need to know what the justice problem is, and that they're able to understand what the law says, support them in finding solutions. And then there need to be services that actually meet their needs and their wants, what they want from the justice system. I will, in the interest of time, I will not go into too much detail on this one, but a key principle of the Sustainable Development Goals is to leave no one behind. And so in our report, and also in our work since we published the report, we have focused on specifically on justice for women, justice for children, and justice for refugees. And again, this is a people-centered approach, in the sense that if you focus on people, you will see that they're not all the same, obviously. So the justice system must adapt depending on the situation, depending on the people who they are dealing with. Okay, so then I have quite a bit more. Let me see how. Okay, there's time. Very good. I will then speak to you a little bit, and this is actually after the Justice for All report. So again, in 2019, we published the Justice for All report. We had a whole program for implementation after that, and then as we are all very well aware, the pandemic hit. So we did a lot of research actually on Justice for All in the public health emergency, Justice for All in the economic crisis, and Justice for All in the social contract in peril. These were all themes in the context of the pandemic. And these are more recent reports, although the first one, of course, was written very much at the beginning of the pandemic. These were joint efforts that we undertook, and it was really thinking through what people-centered justice meant in that current context, as justice systems and justice actors were adapting and trying to deal with this new reality. So I will quickly run through the findings of those briefings. The Justice for All in the public health emergency. Again, we wrote this report in April 2020, so it's very early on. We didn't do it on our own. We had inputs from around 40 or 50 experts from around the world, really trying to grapple on with all these changes and challenges that the pandemic posed at the time. So the main changes, and one of the key messages of that report was that justice actors were really in the front line of the pandemic. So of course, when we were talking about the public health emergency, everybody thought about the doctors and the nurses, who were very much on the front line. But justice actors were also on the front line of the pandemic, dealing with ever-changing regulations and public health measures at heightened risk of abuse. And also we also drew attention for the people who were in the justice system, people who were in prison, people who were working in the justice system. And what we saw, and I'm sure you've all seen this in your work as well, is that there was innovation happening in the justice sector almost overnight. So where there were slow changes, pilots, some initiatives here and there. It wasn't really until the pandemic hit and a lot of these questions around accessibility and access to services became critical that everybody had to improvise and make changes in there. Suddenly there were remote courts. There were different ways of accessing court systems, digital exchange of documents, phone lines, all kinds of changes were taken overnight. Now, I won't go too much into that early phase, but I do think what we're seeing now, and we have been seeing, is that the first couple months were really improvisation and again, changes happening overnight. But over time, and as the dust settles, and as we hopefully leave this pandemic behind us, the question then becomes, what of these technologies can we maintain? What can we use? Where does it actually benefit everyone? And where has it actually created new barriers? Because of course, we're very well aware that there are new digital barriers or digital divide that can impact people's ability to access justice systems if they are generally provided remotely. There are issues that have emerged around court cases taking place remotely with people in unsafe situations, et cetera, et cetera. So there's much more to discover there. The second layer of the impact of the pandemic, as we at least framed it at the time, is the economic crisis, which is still unfolding and shape-shifting all the time. But what does that mean for justice actors and for providing access to justice for all? So what we looked at in that briefing, and I will not go through all the problems, but we looked at those most common justice problems that I mentioned earlier. And for each of those most common justice problems, we tried to do an analysis of what had changed and what is required from justice actors in response to that. And so the key slide that I picked out of that briefing to say a few words about here is on how justice for all, providing justice for all, can also support the economic recovery and can help mitigate the effects of the economic crisis. And economic crisis, and again, since it's shape-shifting all the time, really those shifts in the economy and in people's lives. Just a few highlights out of that. The first one we started is that you can anticipate demand. And I think that is something that the justice sector and justice actors are not typically doing, looking ahead. Typically, the justice actors will wait for cases to arrive and then deal with them. And we urged them in this briefing to actually say, well, if we know that there's an eviction moratorium now, but that will be ending at some point, then we can anticipate a lot of cases coming out of that. So you can anticipate the demand on the system and then think that through and be much more practical about actually helping people responding more quickly, addressing procedural issues, addressing legislative issues that may come up. When you anticipate this increase in justice problems, there's another element that we highlighted, and that I think those are the three next ones: investing in personal contact, addressing problem clusters, and prioritizing non-court solutions, which in a way is very much at the core of what people-centered justice is about. It is about investing in personal contact, so not doing everything in written form or in the abstract procedures, but making that personal connection to resolve problems early on, to de-escalate conflict, and to find solutions in a pragmatic sense. Addressing problem clusters, I think many of you will recognize this from your work. A justice problem seldom comes alone. It's often layers of problems and interconnected problems that appear, and addressing them in clusters is a more effective way of dealing with them. And prioritizing non-court solutions. Again, this is a message that is throughout the Justice for All report, that courts are really only a very small part of resolving people's justice problems empirically in every country in the world, but also that's something that will always be the case. So it's really about connecting court-based solutions with other types of solutions. One element I'd like to point out here also is avoid making justice problems worse. We like to sort of also focus on some of the harms that the justice actors inadvertently often cause. So this is sort of the do no harm principle, which we'll also see on the next slide. But this is really about thinking through the types of procedures that are created, the types of services that are provided, making them less adversarial, making them faster, trying to address conflict early on, manage the emotions related to conflict, et cetera, et cetera. So those are all key elements of people-centered justice that will also help resolve those justice problems as they shift much more easily for people. Okay, so then justice for all and the social contract in peril. And I think that's very much the phase where we are now. We wrote the briefing about a year ago, but you can see it in every country in the world as the pandemic, and then the other big problems in our world, the climate crisis, the Black Lives Matter movement, the war in Ukraine, all those big shifts that are happening around us. They've led to a mobilization in many countries in the world and protests. And many of these protests are about justice. They are about racial justice. They're about gender justice, climate justice, intergenerational justice. So people are calling out for justice, and that is justice in a broad sense, in a value for society. But what is our justice system if it doesn't contribute to addressing some of these calls for justice? And so in this briefing, we reviewed some of those protests, what's happening in the world, what is happening to social contracts in many countries around the world. And of course, every country is different. So it's very, when you speak about these global level briefings, they're also always a little bit more abstract. But we do see those patterns of social contracts being in peril, increasing demonstrarations, increasing strikes in some cases, violence, conflicts, coups even. So that is sort of this general notion of the social contract in peril, and that is related to trust in society and whether people trust the institutions. And so in our briefing, we looked at how justice actors can really address some of those issues, and how justice can act as a society's immune system, and tackling many of the problems before they escalate and before they proliferate. So this is always about people's justice problems at the individual level, and what are the impacts then in society, between communities, et cetera, et cetera. So 5 key elements that we pulled out there. And again, this is very much in line with the Justice for All report and the other things you've heard me say. But the first one is really to understand grievances. And this is a call for data, for doing surveys, for asking people what the problems are, where and how are justice problems increasing, and using that also as a thermometer in a way of what's happening in society, where problems are likely to arise, so that you can act early on. Do no harm, again, this is something I mentioned before, but how does the state respond to protests? But how does the state respond to increasing frustrations and conflicts? How do algorithms used by government to apply the law exclude people, or even actively produce injustice? So we feel it's important to realize and to make people realize how justice actors often actually contribute to injustice, and how important it is to address that. Tackle structural injustice. This is very much about the increase in inequality, the discrimination, the call for racial justice and gender justice, tackling structural injustices that our systems produce and reproduce is critical part of that. Accelerate recovery is very much about inclusion. I mentioned that before, access to public services, including people in the economy and in society, and making sure that the justice system acts as a platform for all that to happen. And then at the center here, resolving disputes, again, resolving people's justice problems, resolving disputes between people or between people and the government is really at the core of what the justice sector should be providing, and we need to become much better at that. The 1.5 billion unresolved justice problems is simply unacceptable, especially because there is so much progress that has been made in understanding conflicts, understanding emotions, in behavioral sciences. So there's so much knowledge and evidence out there on how you can make these procedures work better for people. And so we, as a society, in the broad sense, we need to become much better at resolving disputes, resolving people's justice problems. And then, of course, in the context of the justice in the pandemic, we called that this last briefing. We said we need a justice booster. justice can actually boost trust and strengthen the social contract if it does the right thing. And it will come as no surprise to you that according to my deep conviction that doing the right thing is making that pivot to people-centered justice and putting people at the center of our justice systems. Okay, that was all I wanted to share as an initial kickoff for the findings of the Justice for All report. I will hand it over to Swati, who will speak for a little bit about building the movement for people-centered justice, what we have done and where we are going. Swati, are you ready? Shall I stop sharing my screen?
Yes, Maaike.
Okay, over to you.
Thank you, Maaike. And now my thing has vanished. Just give me a second. All right. Can you see my screen? I can't hear you, Maaike.
Maaike, in presentation mode.
Maaike, can you share? I think something's gone wrong. My computer's playing up. Would you mind sharing?
No problem. You have to stop sharing first, Swati.
Yes, sorry. After all that. Thank you, Maaike. Good morning, everyone. So I was in a meeting just before this meeting. I'd gone to a meeting and someone told me that she really likes the Zoom meetings because she attended 2 Zoom meetings at the same time and was baking cookies. So just to test whether everyone is baking cookies, maybe there'll be a test. But I'm joking. Let's just kind of move on now. So we've heard Maaike talk about the linkages between justice and development, a little bit looking at justice at the social contract. We've spoken about the need for transformative shifts in which we deliver justice and the need to strengthen bonds between people and the state. We also examined some of the ways in which we can actually strengthen, we can start making these shifts. So now we will shift gears and talk about what's been happening globally to achieve equal access to justice. Before we do that, let's take a quick look at what we at Pathfinders have been doing to build the momentum for on justice for all. So as Maaike kind of took us through some of this already, we began with the task force on justice. There was the task Justice for All report, which led to several meetings, which brought together many countries. There was a Hague Declaration, the Buenos Aires Declaration, and the G7 Plus Joint Action Plan, all of which endorsed principles of people-centered justice, which have now found traction and been endorsed by over 60 countries by now. Moving on in 2021, Maaike again took us through some of the briefings and the research we did looking at how do we program on justice, how we think about justice given the context, the pandemic. Several meetings were held at nationally, at the regional level in West Africa, in Asia Pacific. Pathfinders, OECD, and OGP, along with some countries, have been organizing the Global Week on Justice, which brought together many justice leaders, and the global dialogue of justice leaders happened for the first time in 2020 and again in 2021. We will speak a little bit more about the joint letter to the UN Secretary General, which came as a result of the first ministerial meeting, which was held in 2021-2022, and I will speak a little bit more and focus more on the Justice Action Coalition, which has been launched and has brought together 17 countries. And we are the Justice Action Coalition, and we are now looking towards 2023 and the second SDG Summit, which will take stock of where we are and how do we move forward to 2030. 2023 is really very, very crucial and important, not just for the justice community. I think for everyone who's looking at SDGs as we move forward, this is somewhat the midway point for SDGs. And we really need to make it big and see where we are, how do we move from here, how do we achieve our goal of reaching where we had thought we would reach by 2030 in 2015 when we adopted these goals. Thanks, Maaike. At Pathfinders, what we have taking our cue basically from the Justice for All report, we have these 3 pillars that we work on. So we support accelerated national action at the national level. Where we work with countries, trying to ensure that, wherever they're strategizing, thinking about making shifts, we support that action at the domestic level, bringing together countries as Justice Action Coalition to think about sharing practices, good practices with each other, and also supporting them to make commitments on justice, now mostly at the OGP platform, but also to begin with, we were looking at UNDESA and the commitments that were being registered under that platform at the national level. At the global and regional level, we again have been building alliances with partners, with countries, basically focusing on ensuring that there is enough data and evidence to underpin action at the national level, that there is political support, there is financial support for accelerating action at the national level. Then we also, the third pillar focuses on mobilizing justice for all, where we work with our partners so that there are shared narratives on what justice for all means, what people-centered justice means, and how can we take that forward. Next slide, please, Maaike. When we look at the international context these days, it really doesn't look very exciting, does it? In his report on our common agenda, the UN Secretary General kind of lists the big 3 C's, 3 big C's, the crises that face humanity: the corona pandemic, climate change, and the conflicts. And in a post-Ukraine context, we can easily add a looming food crisis to an increasing economic crisis. In this context, multilateralism, the trust between countries and between people, becomes all the more important. We really need to work together to achieve the SDGs. And this is what we've been working towards in the last 2 years. Next slide, please, Maaike. We've been building a high ambition coalition of countries and organizations which is committed to promoting justice and closing the justice gap. In April 2021, ministers from 15 countries came together to discuss people-centered justice. They launched what we call the Justice Action Coalition now, and wrote a letter to the UN Secretary General. The letter basically reiterated the 5 principles of people-centered justice, which I spoke about a little bit earlier, and these have now been endorsed by over 60 countries. This letter requested the Secretary General to and advocated a new approach to the rule of law, the one that allows justice systems to be effective and transparent in addressing injustices and grievances, in tackling inequalities and building resilient societies. Next slide. It basically says you need to transform justice systems by putting people at the center of those justice systems. And the Secretary General's report on our common agenda actually acknowledges that justice is an essential dimension of social contract. And the Secretary General also proposes that he will promote a new vision for rule of law by putting people at the center of justice systems. And at the global level, these discussions are still very much ongoing and should find more traction in the coming days as we look forward to the 2023 summit. The next slides, Maaike. Going back to the second outcome from that ministerial meeting in 2021, the launch of the Justice Action Coalition. So this Justice Action Coalition, as you can see, is a high ambition coalition of countries and partners to champion equal access to justice for all, to close the justice gap and achieve measurable progress in justice outcomes for people and communities by the SDG Summit 2023. These slides basically show you the 18 countries who have joined the Justice Action Coalition. There is interest from many other countries. And there are the next slide indicates the different partners who have come together and working with the Justice Action Coalition to take forward the agenda. Next slide, please, Maaike. We have just come back from the World Justice Forum, which brought together the global justice community towards the end of May and early June to reflect on the justice movement and chart the way forward. Just before the commencement of the World Justice Forum, we had the second ministerial meeting. And in this meeting, ministers and deputy ministers from 17 countries came together and agreed to establish a more permanent structure of the coalition, looking forward to 2030 after 2023. And they also launched the Justice Appeal 2023. The Justice Appeal basically calls upon countries and challenges countries, and the ministers challenge themselves to make the pivot to people-centered justice, to gather more data on people's justice needs and the justice journeys. They agreed that they must co-create strategies to better resolve and prevent people's problems, that they must set shared goals for justice actors, across different sectors, and start implementing strategies to achieve these shared goals, and that they must invest at scale to transform justice and create fair outcomes for people. And the focus needs to shift from processes to outcomes for people. The Justice Appeal also calls upon young people, international and regional organizations, as well as CSOs, academicians, researchers, to capture more data, to produce more evidence of what works to resolve people's problems and to prevent those problems. Next slide, Maaike. As the Justice Action Coalition, when it looks forward to 2023, some of the things that it promises to do is to promote justice at regional and international levels, to speak jointly as different countries. So for example, in the HLPF 2023, we hope some of these countries will come together. They have promised that they will launch the Justice Appeal, and will talk about some of these things in the 2022 HLP, and later on in 2023, the HLPF, the High Level Political Forum at the UN next year, and looking forward to the SDG Summit in September 2023. This is also a forum which mobilizes and campaigns for political and financial support to people-centered justice. The donor countries will look at how they can start supporting, if at all, some of the actions at the country level, and countries which will have agreed to share with each other good practices of what works to resolve and prevent people's problems. And they're, of course, very much interested in bringing more and more countries and organizations into the fold. Some of the things that the next slide is fine, Maaike. Some of the things that are very interesting to look forward to as we move to 2023, the SDG Summit, are the joint deliverables of the Justice Action Coalition. So there are 10 joint deliverables, and most of these are going to be reports and research that will be produced, which will bring together data and evidence which can inform much of the policy and action at the ground level. I don't want to read through these 6 which are in front of you, but you can see there will be a justice data report which different partners will lead, and the countries in the Justice Action Coalition will promote these reports, will own these reports and take them forward. There will be a report on customary informal justice, on transitional justice, on justice gap for women. There will be some regional reports, as we can see, from the Ibero-American region. There will be evidence that under the menu of game changers, there'll be evidence of what works. So there'll be these things that Hill has been working on already in terms of game changers, things which are scalable, investable, and the report will bring all of these things together. Next slide shows you some other reports that are likely to come. Maaike, can we move on to the next slide? So there'll be the Young Justice Leaders, for example, is a cohort which has been convened by the Pathfinders, brings together 7 young people together, and they will be towards 2023 come up with contributions and report and dialogue and research on what the needs of the young people are and how they can take that forward. There'll be something on justice for children. And the last one then speaks about key messages on people-centered justice, which is basically a shared narrative on what people-centered justice means for different organizations. Often when we are talking about people-centered justice, there are still conversations happening that, there is this rule of law, we work on rule of law, institution building, and then there is people-centered justice, which is more access to justice. And we need to bring everything together. And people-centered justice is not only about access to justice and legal aid, it is also about how institutions are reformed. Why do institutions exist? How do they work? Are they outcome oriented or are they more process oriented? How do we make that shift? And those conversations and a shared vision of what people-centered justice means for different organizations, for what does it mean for, say, and a department which issues identity cards, or a department of migration, or a department which works with women and children, or ombudsmen. How do they all think about people-centered justice? How does health department think about justice? So just having some of those shared messages is another thing. I think I probably left one of those reports in the previous page, which talks about the new SDG indicator 16.3.3, which is the only indicator which looks at civil justice. And as Maaike talked about earlier, one of the key findings of the report is that most common problems relate to people's problems which are civil in nature. Of course, violence and crime is a huge issue in people's lives, but so is death and family issues and inheritance and land and identity. And how do we measure, how do we understand those problems, and how do we understand people's journeys as they navigate their pathways would be another report looking at those indicators and how countries kind of report against that new indicator under 16.3.3. I will now stop here, and very happy to request colleagues at Victoria Law Foundation to run quickly a short film, please, which is what the Justice Action Coalition brings together everything that we've just said.
Well, that was sadly a very abrupt end. I'm sure the music probably tapered nicely at the end of that video, but it got chopped off. But incredibly powerful images, I think, to wrap the presentations from Maaike and Swati. And I think roots it right back to all the drama that we are seeing, rolled out across the world on every news bulletin every day. So I think it makes it incredibly powerful. So thank you so much, both of you, for that intense exposure, I think, to the work that's being done at the global level around access to justice. We've got a number of questions, but I think before we kick off, I was a little embarrassed to see that the Australian flag was not prominent in the Justice Action Coalition. So clearly there is some work to be done in our immediate national conversation as well around playing an important and relevant role in the global activity. But let's start with some questions, and Nigel, feel free to jump in with questions or comments too as you see fit. But one question that's had a number of responses, and I will put this to both of you, Swati and Maaike, and you can determine who responds. But I think it does go to that fundamental question that comes up over and over again. We've got limited resources, both in terms of capacity to get, I think, policy traction, and also, you know, in terms of money to implement any change. What are the priorities for action? Now, I think that's bound to differ depending on your jurisdiction, and I think we saw some examples of that in the video just now. But are there some themes that emerge from the work that you see around the world around priorities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, let me just say that the justice sector isn't the only sector where resources are limited by definition. They always are. So this is really a question of strategy, and it does depend on the country and in the context. But let me just say that in making those decisions of where you work and what you prioritize, I do think that part of this whole people-centered justice approach is that your decisions are driven by data. So that's part of that shift that we're working to achieve, and that is data about the problems that people are facing. So again, you know, the justice sector traditionally has internal data, so it knows how many cases are brought to the court, it knows how long a court case lasts, but it doesn't see everything that's outside of those administrative confines. So that you know, opening the windows or looking outside, taking off the blindfold, however you want to put it, but looking at what's really happening, empirical data about the justice problems that people are facing, and who is facing them and where. I think that should be a key starting point for how you then use the limited resources you have. And then the second step in that is what works to resolve justice problems, and being very critical at looking very critically at, you know, are there very long and complicated procedures that we apply that cost way much more money than if you find a more pragmatic approach. Of course, people will then always say, yeah, but there's fundamental rights at stake. Yes, and that's true. But a lot of the cases that people face, you know, the vast majority can often be resolved by relatively simpler solutions, as long as you make sure that if things get complicated, there are still options to escalate or to continue addressing the problem. So I think that data and evidence combined to really drive the decisions on how you can best use those resources is a key component. And that has to also be done in a smart way, because you can't spend all your money on doing surveys and then you know what you should be doing, but all your money is spent. So of course that's also in moderation, and making sure that there's feedback loops between the data you collect, the strategies you apply, and then checking whether it's actually working, et cetera, et cetera. And then one thing that the data does show, and I think that's also something where we sometimes make the parallel with the health sector, is that trying to resolve problems early on, locally, close to where people are, and in a way that matters to them, is also a very cost-effective way of addressing these problems. And so that's where you do get the best results. And if you look at, again, I often compare to the health sector, where they're probably 2 or 3 decades ahead of this whole process from, you know, way back when health was all about hospitals and surgeons. And now you have this whole complex system of all kinds of layers of, you know, of different community health workers, physician assistants, doctors, surgeons, et cetera, et cetera. You have a whole range of actors who communicate and who have systems to do that. And a lot of that, I think, still has to be built in the justice sector, and that's part of then resolving or using the resources the most effective way.
Absolutely. I think, I mean, so much of what you've just said resonates very deeply with us, and you'd probably be aware that data is our friend at the at the VLF. So to that end, before I go off on my own tangent, I should put Josica's question, who is our senior researcher here at the VLF, about collecting data and whether or not there is some insight you can offer us around international directions around collecting people-centered data. I mean, have you heard or seen any strong examples of how that's being done effectively to both identify problems and then to check, as you say, whether or not the response is working?
Sure, and also give Swati a chance to add on. But I mean, I think what we've done in the Justice for All report is really sort of take stock of where we were in data collection at that time. I do think a lot has been happening around the world, including in Australia and in Victoria. But generally speaking, I mean, in terms of people-centered justice data and legal needs surveys, there's a methodology and background information from the OECD that was developed on how you do legal needs surveys, and then there's work ongoing in the PRIA group, which is a group that works on statistics, how justice data can be used and gathered by national statistics offices, so I do think people-centered justice data, that data that goes outside the administrative data, I think is becoming much more common, much more accepted. Methodologies are improving. An increasing number of countries are actually doing those legal needs surveys. Our good partner, the World Justice Project, has an atlas. Swati already put it in the chat. She read my mind. The atlas on legal needs surveys, which gives you an overview of which countries have done which surveys and links to the actual results. So that's sort of where the world is moving. I do think the Victoria Law Foundation is doing some of the most innovative work in this area right now, with different experiences of justice surveys, and a few others like IDRC, a partner from Canada. They have multi-year collaborations with NGOs in African countries to collect people-centered justice data and also evidence on what works best to resolve justice problems.
Swati, did you want to?
I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think Maaike has mentioned that. I would just also point to the fact that the UNDP's Oslo Governance Center has also come up with kind of a guide on how to collect people-centered data on SDG 16, including on justice. So that might be another place where we can, which we can look at for examples. Many other countries are doing it. And in fact, one of the things that Pathfinders does is, for example, we've been working closely now with Colombia, which was doing this legal aids legal needs survey as part of their general survey. As Maaike mentioned, sometimes surveys can be very expensive. So to do just a legal needs survey, sometimes countries find it difficult. They do it more as an add-on. So what we did was we connected Colombia to some of the partners who've been doing that, to some of the NSOs like the South African one. And the part that we play is to connect countries with other partners and with other countries who've done this. And Colombia has now decided it will do a standalone survey also on justice, which is very exciting and something that we look forward to.
The Colombian survey sounds amazing. I'll ask Nigel if he wants to chip in on that and his shameless advertisement for the OECD work, which he was involved with. But I did hear on the news this morning that Colombia now has a new government. So I'm hoping that the big legal needs survey survives the change in government direction in Colombia. It sounds as if it probably will, but we live in hope. Nigel, did you want to chip in?
Just on the Colombian work, I think it's some of the most exciting legal need survey work going on out there at the moment. It's very well resourced. It's methodologically interesting. So I'm really holding out for that one. I think alongside Argentina was another one that I thought was excellent. But yeah, there's some fine work going on. While I'm speaking, I'll ask a question, I guess. So just returning to the Justice for All report, I think one of the things that I found really fascinating, that really brought it to light, was the incredible diversity of things that work around the world. And we'll see some familiar things here in Australia. So you see reference to drug courts, we see reference to community legal centres, but we also see some incredibly diverse things. So paralegals on motorbikes, glass courts, and we see some common themes that we might think of to do with accessibility, to do with transparency, integration, tailoring, partnership, broadening the people who can do different things. But I was just wondering, when you were compiling all of this, was there anything that jumped out to you guys as particularly exciting, particularly surprising, and not wanting to second guess the Game Changers report that Swati mentioned, but anything that seemed particularly scalable or transferable to other jurisdictions?
I mean, you know, when you do a big report like that, you collect so much evidence, and there's so many interesting examples, and they're all a little bit different, and they're all tailored to their context. I mean, one of those input reports or sort of sub-reports that were made is from the innovation group, and that one had, in terms of sort of the really innovative, also innovative in the technical sense, digital sense, examples there. I found quite interesting, a whole list of apps that are being developed, but those are sort of the high tech things that are happening, and Hill is an important partner, and they really invest in the social entrepreneurship and encouraging justice entrepreneurs to you know, pitch their ideas, and then to pilot them, and then sort of through the whole scaling exercise, getting investment, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the social entrepreneur legal tech side of things, but a lot of it actually comes back to one of the core game changers that I think is happening everywhere in different shapes and forms, and that is the community legal services, and that takes it takes different shapes in some, as you mentioned, some countries it's people on motorcycles, in other countries it's legal clinics connected to the university. So there's variations, but I think in essence it's linked to this idea of what I also mentioned from the health sector, you know, the community health provider. It's taking these services to where people are, where they need them, where they can access them, and then designing a system behind that escalates those cases that need to be escalated, but also resolve those that can be resolved. And what we've seen, I mean, one of the examples also in the report, but that we've also published a separate case study about, is the example from Argentina, where in Argentina it was actually the government. So in many cases these legal clinics are civil society run, but in Argentina it was actually the government who invested in centers for access to justice, around 90 throughout the country, including in very remote areas, where they did a number of things. One, they made them close to where people were. They made them free and accessible. They made the teams multidisciplinary. These are all things I think that you probably have in Australia as well, many other countries. So it's a mix of lawyers with legal knowledge, but also social workers, psychologists, people who know how the public service works, where you have to go to get public services, etc. So it's multidisciplinary teams, very accessible also in terms of the language that they use. People can actually go to the center and get help from a person. It's not all through apps, although often the phone lines are part of that service as well. And then really looking at what the issues are and helping people resolve them. And a lot of these justice problems have a justice aspect to them, but they can also be about conflict. It can be about divorce. It can be about paying alimony. It can be about losing your job. A lot of those can be about your neighbors. All those issues also have emotions and conflict aspects, and being able to listen, deal with those emotions, help people see which part is grief, which part is actual legal problem. For example, those are the way you make those services really people centered, and help people to move on, resolve them or move on, and be able to get on with their lives. So a lot of it is about conflict management or conflict prevention, I guess, at that very very local level as well. And a critical part of that is also the access to public services. So I mentioned that as one of the most common justice problems. And that's true in every country in the world. The systems are there, but people have a hard time accessing the services that they are entitled to, and helping them resolve those issues is a very important part of making sure that they are able to again, to get what they're entitled to, exercise their rights, however you want to frame it exactly. But so I do think, again, it's perhaps, it's maybe not the sexiest, but it is the most critical, getting those people-centered justice services to where people are.
And speaking of people-centered approaches, which is, I think, a really interesting shift in thinking, which, you know, this is such a powerful mechanism in driving. There was a question around admin data and seeing people in admin data around services, courts, tribunals, and the like. And this is work that that we're involved with currently, with mapping the admin data in various aspects of our justice system here. But is that something that you see more globally as well? In other parts of the world, there is an effort to understand who are the people that are showing up at the institutions, as well as those that are missing out.
Yeah, and I think when I speak of admin data, it's often in the sense that that's too limited, but I understand, and I've read about the efforts that you are doing to actually use that as a source of important information as well. Also, in part to cover what your, you know, sort of the blind spots, as we call them, the parts of the need and the just problems that you don't see, but to disaggregate that data and really understand who is using the services, what are their problems. So I do think that is happening. I think with, you know, I've referred a few times to the calls for gender justice, the call for racial justice, and other marginalized groups that are finally, you know, speaking up and perhaps finally also being heard a bit more. Those analysis, those disaggregated data analysis can help bring home the point, things that they often already know, but then find it in the data, and also to understand it better, because it may also be the importance of the data is to really understand what's happening, obviously. So yes, I do think that's happening. I think that's for example, in the US, where I am from the Netherlands, but I live in New York, around police data, a lot of research around racial disparities in police interactions is coming up. So yeah, that's certainly happening. And the other thing I would just add to that is that what legal needs surveys have shown for a long time, again, this is more the people-centered data collection, is that the clusters. So it's not, I mentioned it somewhere in my presentation, those problems are not, it's not evenly distributed. They really cluster to people who are in difficult situation, and problems often come together, and that requires a different approach from the justice actors as well.
Absolutely. I think for us, investigating the admin data is about seeing who we can divert from, say, courts and tribunals, and try and find other more effective mechanisms earlier in the piece to respond to the problems that people end up spending huge amounts of money and emotion on once they get into a court system. There's a classic sort of league table question, which I will dutifully put around who is doing this well. Is there a country that is exceptional in terms of really working on justice for all that you could nominate?
I mean, yes, I think the country that I like to mention is Canada. I mean, they are really ahead of the curve in many of these aspects, which is not to say they don't have a justice gap. There's a recent book called The Justice Crisis, which spells out in quite a bit of detail what the justice problems in Canada are. But I do think they have done a number of things over the past decade or so that are good examples for other countries to learn from. One of which is setting justice development goals, so setting shared goals for the entire sector that people can work towards jointly. Because one of the concerns, of course, in the justice sector is you have a number of actors who depend on each other, but are also independent and have to be independent, constitutionally, particularly in the criminal justice sphere, but also in the civil justice sphere and in the administrative justice sphere. So you don't have this is where there's not such a good comparison to the health sector, where you have a minister of health who is sort of at the top of the pyramid and can, it's also not entirely true, but anyway, it's a little bit simpler in the health sector. In the justice sector, a lot of those key actors, the judiciary, the police, the lawyers, the bar associates, et cetera, they have independence, and they need to have independence. At the same time, they have a collective role to play in terms of providing justice to society. And so setting shared goals that people can work, independently work towards, and then collaborate and align efforts where that makes sense without giving up their independence, I think is a good example. Canada also has a recent legal needs survey, and they have been strong advocates for SDG 16. But there's some other, there's interesting things happening in other countries as well. I mentioned Argentina with the the access to justice centers, of which we did the case study. And I always say there's people working for justice in every country of the world, and there's interesting things happening everywhere as well.
As Nigel's just put in the chat very swiftly, Trevor Farrow, who wrote The Justice Crisis, is a friend of ours at the Foundation, and he spoke at one of these events sometime.
Oh, excellent.
If you want to catch up on what he explained around the challenges in Canada, then that talk, I think, is still available on our website.
I just put the link to his talk in the chat.
Perfect. Well, we probably need to very sadly wind this up, but I suppose in listening to both your presentations, Swati and Maaike, and trying to work that in with all that we know and understand of the Australian context, there is an issue in maintaining momentum. I'm going to quote the famous Professor Nigel Balmer here and refer to a remark he made when I first met him, and he arrived in Australia to work with us here in Melbourne, and said, "Oh, Australia's the land of pilots, because we're forever testing things, and then sort of, that comes to an end and the money runs out, and it may have generated some really interesting insights and some really good outcomes for people, but it stops dead and gathers dust." So I suppose in terms of the global effort to maintain momentum around justice for all, clearly there's the SDG event in 2023, which seems terrifyingly close in terms of what I suppose needs to be presented at that, and then the 2030 aspirations as well. But are you confident that there is a strong commitment to this around the world, and that it is gathering momentum and traction in the places that it really needs to, in order to really deliver on SDG 16? Because it would be terrible if this was one of those efforts that had, a moment in time for maybe 10 or 15 years of global attention, and then for whatever reason got swept up in wars and famine and racial drama and kind of fell away. So I suppose I'm asking for a perspective on whether or not this is sustainable in itself as an effort.
I mean, the world around us does not look so nice these days. So there's a certain hesitation, but I'm forever an optimist, or as I recently heard that Desmond Tutu used to say, he was a prisoner of hope. So that's a beautiful way to say it. I mean, I think in terms of the movement for people-centered justice, just to make it a little bit more concrete, I think we're building a group of, we're strengthening the political leadership. Swati mentioned the Justice Action Coalition and the 60 countries who have endorsed the principles of people-centered justice. So we're growing that body of ideas and the political support for those ideas. Is that going fast enough? No. Is the money following fast enough? No. You know, we need a lot more work for sure. But I'm also really optimistic in the sense that I do think that all those logos you saw on one of our slides of all the partners who are working together, I think more than ever before, and partly that's due to technology and all of us now being completely used to Zoom meetings. But there's a growing group of organizations who are really working and aligning their efforts and making this this more and more prominent and hopefully at some point inescapable. And the other thing I also gives me hope is that in Argentina, for example, those centers of justice, I just keep coming back to them because I've explained it, but when there was a new government, those centers were so sort of, you know, rooted in the communities that the new government couldn't just cancel that. So to some extent, I think a lot of these things are starting to take hold, and if they do provide what people need, no politician in their right mind will then just abolish it, because it serves a purpose. So I think connecting those organizations, working on the political momentum, and bringing together the people around the world in countries that are working, you know, with this approach, and it is growing by the day, the number of people who are doing that. You know, I think together we can make that pivot that we are calling for, and we have to remain hopeful that that will achieve the change we're working towards.
On that optimistic note, and I think cautious optimism, but positive nevertheless. Thank you both very much indeed, Swati, Mehta and Maaike de Langen, who join us today to talk about the Justice for All report. And if you're ever in the neighbourhood, if you find yourself in Melbourne, please come and see us at the Foundation. We would love to play host. Just a quick wrap up for all our participants today. As you're probably aware, our research network events happen quarterly, and we would love to hear from you if you've got bright ideas about things you'd be interested in hearing about, or work that you're doing that you think would be of great interest to a broader audience. Please get in touch with Tennille Hagland to discuss your ideas. We would love to hear from you. And thank you ever so much for joining us for today. Feel free to spread the word and the love, and the video version of this conversation. We'll have it up on the website very soon, and we'll send you a link as well. Nigel, a pleasure as always. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll see you again next time for another Research Network event from the VLF. Have a lovely day.